The skies over Redemption Creek had never looked so angry. Black clouds rolled like waves of ink across the horizon, swallowing the last rays of sunlight. Thunder cracked like a whip, and rain fell in sheets so thick a man could drown standing. Up, the river that had once been the town's blessing now swelled with fury, threatening to become its curse. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the growing darkness, a lone rider approached. His silhouette was sharp against the storm-lit sky, tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, face half hidden beneath a sodden hat. The townspeople who spotted him from behind shuttered windows, crossed themselves, or reached for weapons. They knew who he was. Elijah Wolfe, the half-Apache outlaw whose name mothers used to frighten disobedient children. A man with blood on his hands and darkness in his past. None of them could have guessed that before the waters receded, this same feared outsider would risk everything to save the preacher's daughter, or that the town's gratitude would quickly twist into an ultimatum that would change all their lives forever. Mud clung to Elijah Wolfe's boots as he dismounted outside Donovan's saloon, the only establishment in Redemption Creek still lit against the growing storm. His horse, a muscled sorrel stallion with eyes like coal, snorted against the rain. Elijah patted the animal's neck, a gesture of reassurance more genuine than any he'd offered a human in years. "Easy, Thunder," he murmured, securing the reins. "To the hitching post." "Won't be long." Lightning split the sky, illuminating the scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw. A reminder of the last time he'd set foot in this town 10 years ago. He was younger then, softer. The world had hardened him since, carved away everything but necessity and grit. The saloon fell silent as he pushed through the bat-wing doors. Conversations died mid-sentence. Cards froze in weathered hands. Only the piano player, too drunk to notice, continued plinking out a melancholy tune. Elijah moved to the bar with the careful grace of a mountain lion, aware of every eye tracking. His movement, every hand inching toward a hidden weapon. "Whiskey," he said, his voice low and rough from disuse. The bartender, Sam Donovan, a man whose belly had grown in proportion to his greed, hesitated before reaching for a bottle. "Money first," Donovan said, his voice carrying in the unnatural. "Quiet." Elijah placed a silver dollar on the counter. Its ring against the wood seemed to release some of the tension. A few conversations cautiously resumed. The card game picked up again, but the wary eyes remained. "Didn't expect to see you back in these parts," Donovan said, sliding over a glass of amber liquid. "Not after what happened with the Millers." Elijah didn't respond. The Millers were a wound he'd cauterized long ago, or thought he had. He drank, the whiskey in one swallow, feeling it burn all the way down. "I'm just passing through," he finally said. "Need supplies? Then I'll be gone by morning." A harsh laugh came from a corner table. Sheriff Wade Parker, older now, gray streaking his mustache, but with the same mean eyes Elijah remembered. "That's what you said last time," Parker called out. "Before you burned down half the town and killed 3 good men." "They weren't good men," Elijah said quietly, "and it was one building." The piano player hit a sour note, then stopped altogether. The silence was complete now. "They were better than a half-breed outlaw," Parker spat. "Your kind isn't welcome here." Elijah turned slowly to face the sheriff. His hand didn't move toward the revolver on his hip, but the intent was there in his. Stillness, a predator deciding whether to strike. "My money's the same color as anyone else's," he said. "I'll be gone when the storm breaks." As if punctuating his words, thunder boomed overhead, so close it rattled the bottles behind the bar. Through the rain-streaked windows, lightning illuminated, the street now ankle-deep in water. The river was rising faster than anyone had anticipated. Parker stood, hand resting on his gun. "See that you are, or I'll finish what should have been done years ago." Before Elijah could respond, the saloon doors burst open. A young man stumbled in, soaked to the bone, panic etched on his face. "Sheriff," he gasped, "the North Bridge just washed out. Johnson's place is underwater and the dam at Miller's Creek is straining. Reverend Cooper sent me to ring the alarm bell." Parker cursed, forgetting Elijah momentarily. "How long have we got?" "Hours, maybe less. The Reverend's gathering folks at the church. It's on high ground." The saloon erupted in motion, men downing drinks, grabbing hats, rushing for the door. Amid the chaos, Elijah remained still, an island of calm. He'd seen floods before, knew their hunger, their patience, their power to erase mistakes and make new ones. When the room had emptied, except for Donovan frantically packing bottles into crates, Elijah spoke. "The church still up on Hawkins Hill?" Donovan nodded without looking up. "Where it's always been, though Reverend Cooper would sooner see you drown than seek shelter there." Elijah left another coin on the bar and stepped back into the storm. The rain had intensified, beating against his hat and shoulders like tiny fists. The water in the street now reached his calves, carrying debris in its muddy current. Fence posts, barrels, a child's doll face down like a drowning victim. He mounted. Thunder, who pranced nervously against the rising water. The road to the livery stable was already submerged, and in the distance he could hear the church bell ringing its frantic warning. But rather than heading toward the sound, Elijah turned, his horse toward the river. He needed to see it for himself, needed to understand what they were facing. The Apache side of his heritage had taught him to read the land, to see warnings in the bend of a grass blade or the flight pattern of birds. His white father had taught him only how to fear and fight. In moments like these, he embraced his mother's. Blood, the river roared in the darkness, a beast awakened and hungry. Where it normally flowed 20 feet below the banks, it now clawed just 5 feet from the top. Trees that had stood for decades were being torn away, their roots exposed like broken fingers grasping at empty air. Against the far bank, a wooden structure, someone's home, tilted crazily before being pulled into the current and smashed against rocks. Elijah watched, calculating. If the rain continued through the night, the river would reach the lower part of town by dawn. The church on the hill would be safe, but anything below Main Street was in danger, including the widow Larson's boarding house, where he'd planned to stay, and the general store where he needed supplies. As he turned to head back to town, a flash of movement caught his eye. Across the river, barely visible through the rain, a figure in a pale dress stood precariously close to the eroding bank. Even at this distance, he recognized her. Sarah Cooper, the preacher's daughter. What the hell was she doing out in the storm, alone, so close to danger? Before he could shout a warning, the bank beneath her gave way. One moment she was there, a pale ghost against the darkness. The next she was gone, swallowed by the churning waters. Elijah didn't think. He drove his heels into Thunder's sides and raced along the bank, eyes locked on the spot where she'd disappeared. The river bent sharply a quarter-mile downstream, creating a natural catch basin where debris and bodies often washed up. If he could reach it before she did, there might be a chance. Thunder seemed to understand the urgency, hooves cutting through the mud with desperate speed. They reached the bend just as Sarah's form tumbled in the current. She was still fighting, head bobbing above water, arms flailing, but the river was winning. Elijah dismounted in one fluid motion, tied his rope to Thunder's saddle horn, and secured the other end around his waist. The horse knew to brace itself. They'd done similar rescues with stranded cattle on his uncle's ranch years ago. The water hit him like a wall, knocking the breath from his lungs. The current immediately tried to drag him downstream, but the rope held taut. He pushed forward, fighting for every inch. The rain continued to lash his face, making it difficult to see, but he caught glimpses of pale fabric against the dark water. She was caught on something, a broken tree branch perhaps, just beyond his reach. Her face appeared briefly above. The surface, eyes wide with terror, mouth open in a scream swallowed by the river's roar. Then she went under again. Elijah lunged forward, the rope cutting into his waist. His fingers brushed fabric, then closed around an arm. He pulled her to him, locked an arm around her waist, and with his free hand gave 3 sharp tugs on the rope, the signal for Thunder to back up. The river fought to keep its prize, but slowly, agonizingly, horse and rope won out. Inch by inch, they were dragged toward the bank until finally, gasping and coughing, Elijah dragged them both onto solid ground. Sarah Cooper lay unconscious beside him, her dress plastered to her body, dark hair a tangled mess across her too pale face. But she was breathing. He pressed his ear to her chest to be sure, relief flooding him at the steady, if faint, beat of her heart. "Miss Cooper," he said, tapping her cheek lightly. "Sarah, wake up!" Her eyelids fluttered, then opened. For a moment confusion clouded her features, then recognition and with it fear. "Wolf," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. He nodded, already removing his coat to place around her shoulders. "What were you doing out here alone?" She struggled to sit up, accepting the coat with shaking hands. "The Turners. Baby, it came early. I was helping deliver it when the water started rising. They sent me for help, but the bridge—" Her voice broke as she looked back at the river, obviously realizing what had nearly happened. "The Turners live across the river, past the North Bridge?" Elijah asked, dread settling in his stomach. Sarah nodded. "Their farm is on the lowland. By now it's—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Elijah helped her to her feet. She stood unsteadily, clutching his arm for support. "We need to get to high ground," he said. "Can you ride?" Before she could answer, voices called out in the darkness. Lanterns bobbed like fireflies along the path from town. "A search party." "Sarah! Sarah Cooper!" The voice belonged to Reverend Matthew Cooper, a man who'd once called for Elijah to be hanged. "Answer me, girl!" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Here, Father," Sarah called back, her voice stronger now. "I'm here!" The lanterns moved faster, and soon 5 men appeared through the rain. Reverend Cooper, tall and rigid in his black coat, Sheriff Parker, hand already on his gun, and 3. Townsman Elijah didn't recognize. "Get away from her!" Reverend Cooper's voice cracked like a commandment. He rushed forward, pulling Sarah roughly from Elijah's side. "What have you done to my daughter?" "He saved me, Father," Sarah said, still clutching Elijah's coat around her shoulders. "I fell in the river. He pulled me out." The Reverend looked from his daughter to Elijah, disbelief warring with the evidence before him. "Is this true?" Elijah didn't answer. Instead, he turned to retrieve his rope from Thunder's saddle. "The Turners are still out there," he said over his shoulder. "Trapped by the flood with a newborn." Sheriff Parker stepped forward. "We know. We've already sent men in boats from the South Ford. They'll bring them out if it's possible." "If," Sarah repeated, her voice hollow. Reverend Cooper pulled his daughter closer. "It's in God's hands now. But you—" He looked at Sarah with a mixture of relief and fury. "You nearly killed yourself with your foolishness." "I was trying to help," she protested. "Your place is at home, safe, not running wild in storms," the Reverend snapped. Then, reluctantly, he turned to Elijah. "As for you, it seems we owe you thanks." The words clearly cost him, each one dragged out like a rotten tooth. Elijah finished coiling his rope. "You owe me nothing, but the flood's coming faster than you think. By morning, half the town will be underwater." "And how would you know that?" Parker challenged. "Because I've seen it before. The signs are all there, the rate of the rise, the color of the water, the debris pattern." Elijah mounted Thunder, looking down at the group. "You should move everyone to higher ground than the church. The hill behind the cemetery would be better." Reverend Cooper bristled. "We don't need advice from someone who just saved your daughter's life," Elijah cut in, his patience finally fraying. "Believe what you want about me, Reverend, but I know floods, and this one's hungry." Without waiting for a response, he turned Thunder toward town. The rain continued to fall, drumming a warning only he seemed able to hear. Behind him, Sarah Cooper watched him go, still wrapped in his coat that smelled of leather, horse, and something wild that didn't belong in Redemption Creek. Something that, despite everything she'd been taught, called to her like the distant howl of wolves in the mountains. The night had only just begun, and already the waters were rising to wash away, the barriers between worlds that should never touch. By morning, everything would be changed. Some things destroyed forever, others born anew in the purifying flood. Dawn broke grey and sullen over Redemption Creek. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, but the damage was already done. The river had swollen to 3 times its normal size, a churning brown monster that devoured everything in its path. Main Street had become a shallow canal, water lapping at doorsteps and seeping under doors. The lower part of town was already submerged. To the rooftops, Elijah Wolfe stood on the church steps, watching the townspeople who had gathered through the night. Some prayed in huddled groups, others argued about what to do next. Children cried for toys left behind, for pets unaccounted for. The air was thick with fear and the musty smell of wet wool and unwashed bodies. He'd spent the night in the church stables, against Reverend Cooper's wishes, but with grudging permission from Sheriff Parker, who'd admitted they might need an extra pair of hands before this was over. Elijah had no illusions. They'd throw him out the moment the waters receded. For now, though, his knowledge of floods made him temporarily valuable. "Mr. Wolfe?" He turned to find Sarah Cooper standing behind him, his coat folded neatly in her arms. She changed into a simple blue dress, her hair tied back in a practical braid. The only evidence of her near drowning was a bruise blooming along her jawline and the shadows under her eyes. "Your coat," she said, holding it out. "Thank you for the loan." He took it with a nod. "You should be resting. There's too much to be done." Her gaze drifted past him to the flooded town below. The Turners made it out. Their baby, too, though Mrs. Turner is feverish. They lost everything else. Elijah shrugged into his coat. It smelled faintly of lavender now. Her scent mingled with his. "Most things can be replaced." "Not all things," she said quietly. Then with sudden directness, "Why did you come back to Redemption Creek after what happened with the Millers?" He studied her. How much did she know? She would have been just a child 10 years ago, 14, maybe 15. Old enough to hear the gossip, young enough to believe whatever version her father preached. "I needed supplies," he said finally. "Your town was on my route north." "North to where?" "Montana Territory. I have family there." Sarah's eyes, a startling shade of green in her pale face, held his steadily. "You're lying." Before he could respond, a commotion erupted near the church doors. Reverend Cooper emerged, followed by the town council, Sheriff Parker, Mayor Wilson, Dr. Abernathy, and old Judge Hollister. They gathered on the steps, faces grim. "Brothers and sisters," Reverend Cooper called out, his voice carrying across the churchyard. "The Lord has seen fit to test us with this flood, but we shall endure as Noah endured. We have established shelter here and in the schoolhouse on the North Hill. There is enough food for 3 days, by which time we pray the waters will recede." Mayor Wilson stepped forward, a portly man with anxious eyes. "We've formed rescue parties to check for stragglers and salvage what supplies we can. Anyone willing to volunteer should speak to Sheriff Parker." The crowd murmured. A few men stepped forward, mostly younger fellows with strong backs and something to prove. "What about the dam?" someone called out. "If Miller's Creek Dam breaks, we'll lose the whole valley." Sheriff Parker raised a hand for quiet. "We've sent men to shore it up, but there's only so much that can be done in this weather." "My mill will be destroyed if that dam breaks," shouted another voice. "Everything I've worked for, gone." "Better the mill than your life, Jacob," Dr. Abernathy said wearily. "We must focus on survival now. Property can be rebuilt." The debate continued, voices rising with the same urgency as the floodwaters. Elijah watched the panic spread through the crowd like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. He'd seen it before, how quickly civilization crumbled when nature reminded humans of their true place in the order of things. Sarah leaned closer to him, speaking under the noise. "The dam won't hold, not with this much rain. You know that for certain?" She nodded. "My father took me up there last spring to baptize the Miller children. It was already crumbling then. Mr. Miller patched it with whatever he could find, old wagon wheels, fence posts, even parts of a broken plow. He couldn't afford proper repairs," Elijah frowned. "Did you tell them?" He nodded toward the town leaders. "They don't listen to women about such things," she said with a hint of bitterness. "Especially not the preacher's daughter. I'm expected to serve coffee and quote scripture, not give structural assessments." An unexpected smile tugged at his lips. "You don't seem like the type to do what's expected." "Neither do you," she countered, but there was no malice in her voice. Their conversation was interrupted by Reverend Cooper, who had noticed his daughter standing too close to the outlaw. His face darkened as he strode toward them. "Sarah," he said sharply, "your place is inside, helping the women with the children." "I was just returning Mr. Wolf's coat," she said, her tone suddenly meek, a mask Elijah suspected she wore often. "That task is completed," Reverend Cooper said. "Now go inside." He turned cold eyes on Elijah. "As for you, Sheriff Parker is organizing the rescue parties. Make yourself useful or move on." Elijah kept his face impassive. "The dam at Miller's Creek is being handled," the Reverend cut him off. "We don't need your counsel on matters you know nothing about." Sarah opened her mouth, as if to speak, then closed it, her gaze dropping to the ground. With a last glance at Elijah, she turned and went inside the church. Reverend Cooper lingered, his tall frame rigid with barely contained hostility. "My daughter has a tender heart. She believes she owes you a debt for last night. Let me be clear. Whatever happened at the river, it doesn't change what you are or what you did in this town." "And what exactly am I, Reverend?" Elijah asked quietly. "A killer. A half-breed who brought nothing but death and dishonor to a family that took you in. The Millers treated you like a son, and how did you repay them? With fire and blood." Elijah's jaw tightened. "You don't know what happened that night." "I know." "Enough." The Reverend's eyes were cold as winter. "Stay away from my daughter. Once this flood passes, you'll leave Redemption Creek and never return. Am I understood?" Without waiting for an answer, he turned and followed Sarah into the church. Elijah stood alone on the steps, watching the rain fall on the drowned town. The familiar anger coiled in his stomach, but he pushed it down. The Reverend, like most men of God he'd encountered, saw the world in simple terms: good and evil, black and white, saved and damned. There was no room in such a worldview for the grey truths that had defined Elijah's life. He turned his attention to the dam. If Sarah was right, and something told him she usually was, then the worst was yet to come. Redemption Creek would soon face a reckoning far more immediate than divine judgment. Sheriff Parker was organizing men near the churchyard gate, dividing them into groups with assigned sectors of the town to search. Elijah approached, ignoring the distrustful glances from the other volunteers. "I want to check the dam," he said without preamble. Parker barely looked up from his map. "Already sent Mason and the Calloway boys. They know what they're doing. Not if they think it can be saved." Elijah pointed northwest, where dark clouds still gathered. "There's more rain coming. That dam was never built to handle this much. Water, "And you're suddenly an expert on dams?" Parker sneered. "I helped build 3 of them on Apache land." It wasn't entirely true. He'd helped repair them, not build them from scratch. But it was close enough. If Miller's Creek Dam fails, the water will funnel straight through the valley and hit the town from the west. Everyone on this hill will be cut off. This got Parker's attention. "What are you suggesting?" "That you move these people higher up, beyond the cemetery like I said last night. And that someone who knows what they're looking at assesses that dam." Parker studied him, suspicion warring with practicality. Finally, he cursed under his breath. "Fine, take Jenkins and go check the dam. But this doesn't make us friends. Wolf." "Wouldn't dream of it, Sheriff." 15 minutes later, Elijah and Martin Jenkins, a young rancher with a nervous disposition, were riding north along the ridge that overlooked the valley. The rain had intensified again, driving into their faces with stinging force. Below them, the destruction was laid bare in daylight. Homes reduced to rooftops poking above the muddy water, drowned livestock floating bloated near what had once been pastures, the twisted remains of the North Bridge jutting from the river, like broken bones. "Never seen it this bad," Jenkins shouted over the wind. "Flood of '63 was high, but nothing like this." Elijah nodded, keeping his eyes on the trail ahead. The mud was getting deeper, threatening to suck the horses down if they strayed from the rocky spine of the ridge. Thunder handled it well, mountain-bred and sure-footed, but Jenkins' mare struggled, whinnying in distress as her hooves slipped on the treacherous ground. "We should turn back," Jenkins called after another near fall. "Can't even see the dam." "Through this rain! It's just ahead." Elijah pointed to where the ridge curved around the hillside. "Past those pines." Jenkins looked unconvinced, but pressed on. They rounded the bend, and suddenly the dam came into view, or what remained of it. "Dear God," Jenkins breathed. The structure was visibly bulging, the center bowing outward under the pressure of the water behind it. Debris, entire trees, parts of buildings, even what looked like a wagon, pressed against the already weakened barrier. The makeshift repairs Sarah had described were failing one by one. Water sprayed through a dozen leaks, and the sound of straining wood and stone was audible even over the storm. "Where are Mason and the Callaways?" Jenkins asked, scanning the area. Elijah spotted them, 3 figures on the far side of the dam, frantically shoving rocks and timber against the base. Their efforts were pitiful against the force they were trying to contain. "They need to get out of there," Elijah said urgently. "That whole thing's about to go." As if the dam had heard him, a section near the center suddenly cracked, a jagged line splitting the wood. Water immediately began spurting through with greater force. "Mason!" Jenkins shouted, waving frantically. "Get clear!" The men either couldn't hear or chose to ignore the warning. They redoubled their futile efforts, now standing knee-deep in the rushing water at the dam's base. "Idiots," Elijah muttered. He dismounted, handing Thunder's reins to Jenkins. "Stay here. If that thing breaks before I reach them, ride back to town and warn everyone. Tell them they have less than an hour before the water hits." "What are you going to do?" Jenkins asked, eyes wide with fear. "Try to save those fools before they drown." Elijah scrambled down the muddy slope, half running, half sliding toward the dam. The roar grew louder as he approached, the sound of water straining for release, of wood and stone losing the battle to contain it. He could see Mason now, a burly blacksmith with arms like tree trunks, shouting orders at the Calloway brothers as they desperately shoved debris against a leaking section. "Get out of there!" Elijah shouted as he came within earshot. "The dam is going to break." Mason glanced up, his face hardening at the sight of Elijah. "Wolf, what the hell are you doing here?" "Trying to stop you from killing yourselves." Elijah reached the edge of the dam's spillway, where rushing water already poured over in a chaotic tumble. "It's too late to save it. We need to get to higher ground." "We can hold it," Mason insisted. "Just need to reinforce this section." The older Calloway brother, Thomas, looked less certain. "Mason, maybe he's right. That crack's getting wider. We're not abandoning the dam because some Apache half-breed says so. Elijah's patience snapped. The dam doesn't give a damn what color my skin is, and neither will the water when it drowns you. Now move! Another crack, louder than the first, punctuated his words. The center of the dam shuddered visibly. Water began to spray from new breaches along the fracture line. The younger Calloway, Peter, dropped his timber and backed away. I'm out, Mason. That thing's coming down no matter what we do. Mason cursed, but finally seemed to grasp the reality of their situation. Fine. Everyone back to the ridge. They hadn't taken 3 steps when the dam's center collapsed with a deafening roar. A wall of water burst through the gap, instantly swallowing the space where they had stood moments before. The force of it shook the ground beneath their feet. "Run!" Elijah shouted, pushing the Calloway brothers ahead of him. "Up the slope!" The water surged behind them, gaining speed as it funneled through the broken dam. Mason stumbled on the muddy incline, went down hard on one knee. Elijah grabbed his arm, hauling him upright. "Move, damn you!" They scrambled up the slope, the water nipping at their heels like a living predator. Jenkins was shouting from above, urging them on. 10 more feet. 5. The water swirled around their ankles, then receded as the slope grew steeper. They reached the top, gasping and mud-covered, just as the full force of the released floodwaters thundered down the valley toward Redemption Creek. The sound was like a freight train, relentless, unstoppable. "My God," Thomas Calloway whispered, watching the destruction unfold below. "The town—" "We need to warn them," Elijah said, already moving toward Thunder. "Jenkins, take the Calloways on your mare. Mason, you're with me." For once, no one argued. The blacksmith climbed up behind Elijah without complaint, and they set off at the fastest pace the treacherous ground would allow. The water moved faster, a churning brown mass consuming everything in its path. "We won't make it in time," Mason said grimly. Elijah urged Thunder to greater speed. "We have to try." They rode hard along the ridge, taking a route that would intersect the road to town. Below them, the flood carved a new path through the valley, obliterating fences, small structures, anything that stood in its way. The rain continued to fall, obscuring visibility and turning the trail to soup. Despite their efforts, the water reached the lower part of Redemption Creek first. From their elevated position, they watched as it slammed into already flooded buildings, tearing some from their foundations. The church and schoolhouse on their hills stood safe for now, but the water quickly surrounded them, cutting off any escape routes. By the time they reached the road down to the church, a crowd had gathered outside, watching in horror as their town was devoured. Sheriff Parker spotted them first, striding forward with his hand on his gun, a habit he seemed unable to break even in the face of natural disaster. "The dam?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. "Gone," Elijah confirmed, dismounting. "The valley's flooded. This hill is now an island, and the water's still rising." Reverend Cooper pushed through the crowd, face pale beneath his beard. "How many dead?" "None at the dam," Mason said, sliding down from Thunder's back. "Thanks to Wolf here. He warned us just before it broke." The admission clearly cost Mason something, but the blacksmith met Elijah's eyes with grudging respect. Murmur went through the gathered townspeople. Elijah ignored it, focusing instead on the practical problems at hand. "The cemetery hill is still your best bet. The water won't reach that high, but the path connecting these 2 hills will be underwater within hours. We can't move all these." "People again," Mayor Wilson protested. "The sick, the elderly, they're exhausted already." "Better exhausted than drowned," Sheriff Parker said grimly. He turned to the crowd. "Start gathering your things. We move in 30 minutes." As the people dispersed to prepare, Sarah appeared at her father's side. Her eyes found Elijah's immediately. "You were right about the dam," she said softly. "Reverend," Cooper frowned at his daughter. "This is not the time for 'I told you so,' Sarah." "I wasn't," she began, then stopped herself. "Yes, Father." Elijah watched the subtle change in her posture, the way she seemed to shrink under her father's disapproval. It reminded him of something, a memory he'd buried long ago. Another young woman, another controlling father. The miller's daughter, Hannah. The realization struck him with unexpected force. Sarah Cooper didn't know the truth about what had happened 10 years ago. No one in this town did. They had their story, their villain, and no interest in anything that might complicate that narrative. But as he watched Sarah quietly organizing the children for the move to higher ground, her gentle efficiency at odds with the steel he'd glimpsed in her eyes, Elijah knew he couldn't simply ride away once the flood receded. Not this time. The water had washed away the barriers between past and present. Now the truth, like the flood itself, would no longer be contained. The cemetery hill loomed like an island in a sea of destruction. Water surrounded its base on all sides now, cutting it off from the rest of the world. The townspeople of Redemption Creek had made the journey just in time, the last stragglers splashing through knee-deep water as the path between the church hill and cemetery ridge disappeared. Beneath the rising flood, night was falling again, the second since the storm began. The rain had finally stopped, but the damage was done. From their vantage point, they could see the remnants of their town. Rooftops, the steeple of the church, the upper story of the hotel, poking above the murky water like tombstones marking where civilization once stood. Elijah Wolfe helped Thomas Calloway secure a makeshift shelter for the elderly and infirm. Canvas salvaged from wagons stretched between trees, creating a rough tent. Inside, Dr. Abernathy tended to Mrs. Turner, whose fever had worsened, and 3 others suffering from exposure and exhaustion. "Never thought I'd be building shelters in a graveyard," Thomas muttered, hammering a stake into the soggy ground. "Seems like tempting fate." "Better than the alternative," Elijah replied, securing a rope to a nearby oak. Thomas glanced at him, then back at his work. "Mason told us what you did at the dam. Said we'd all be drowned if you hadn't shown up." Elijah said nothing, focusing on the knot in his hands. "Why'd you do it?" Thomas pressed. "Risk yourself for men who'd just as soon see you swing?" "Same reason I'd pull a snake from a fire," Elijah said finally. "Being in danger doesn't make you less human." Thomas considered this. Hammer paused mid-swing. "Fair enough." He resumed his work, then added, "Still, thank you." Before Elijah could respond, Sheriff Parker approached, his boots squelching in the mud. Despite the circumstances, his badge still gleamed on his chest, polished and prominent, a symbol of authority he seemed desperate to maintain. "Wolfe," he said curtly. "Reverend Cooper's calling a meeting. Town leaders in 10 minutes by the old Grove Monument." "I'm not a town leader," Elijah pointed out. Parker's mouth twisted. "No, but you seem to know floods better than most. Figured you might have something useful to say for once." It was as close to civility as the sheriff was likely to get. Elijah nodded once and returned to securing the shelter. When he finished, he made his way through the crowded cemetery to the Hargrove Monument, an ostentatious marble angel that had guarded the cemetery's highest point for decades. The town's leadership had already gathered. Reverend Cooper, Sheriff, Parker, Mayor Wilson, Judge Hollister, Dr. Abernathy, and now Mason, whose status as blacksmith and owner of the largest business still standing, apparently granted him a vote. They stood in a rough circle, faces drawn with exhaustion and worry. "The water's still rising," Mayor Wilson was saying as Elijah approached. "Another foot, maybe 2 before it crests if we're lucky. And if we're not?" Judge Hollister asked. The old man's voice quavered slightly, his usual judicial confidence shaken by nature's verdict. "Then we pray," Reverend Cooper said grimly. He acknowledged Elijah's arrival with a slight nod, which was more than Elijah had expected. "How long before the water recedes?" Sheriff Parker asked, addressing Elijah directly. "Depends on what's happening upstream," Elijah said. "But based on the rate of rise and the terrain, I'd say at least 3 days before we can reach the church hill again. Another 2 before the town's accessible. 5 days, Dr. Abernathy muttered. We have medicine and supplies for 3 at E. Most, even with strict rationing. Mayor Wilson wiped his brow with a handkerchief that had seen better days. Any chance of getting help from outside? The railroad station at Copper Creek is only 15 miles west. Might as well be 100 with this flood between us, Mason said. No one's riding out of here until the water drops. Elijah studied the surrounding landscape, considering options others might have missed. There's a ridge that runs northwest from here, follows the old deer trail. It's narrow, but it stays above the waterline. Someone could use it to reach higher ground, then cut west to Copper Creek. The men exchanged glances. You're sure about this trail? Sheriff Parker asked skeptically. I hunted these hills with the Millers before. Elijah paused, the familiar shadow of the past falling between them. Yes, I'm sure. It's passable on horseback, though not easy. Then we send riders for help, Mayor Wilson said, relief evident in his voice. Volunteers who know the area. I'll go, Mason offered. My mare's strong and I know the way to Copper Creek. Sheriff Parker nodded. Take Jenkins with you. 2 riders in case one runs into trouble. I should go, Elijah said quietly. The group fell silent, staring at him with varying degrees of suspicion and surprise. Why would we trust you with this? Reverend Cooper asked, voicing what they all clearly thought. How do we know you won't just keep riding once you're free of here? Elijah met his gaze steadily. Because I'm giving you my word. A harsh laugh escaped Sheriff Parker. The word of a killer doesn't carry much weight, Wolf. I know these hills better than anyone here, Elijah countered, keeping his voice level despite the familiar anger stirring in his chest. And Thunder can handle terrain that would break the legs of most horses. You need help quickly, and I'm your best chance of getting it. He has a point, Dr. Abernathy said reluctantly. If Mrs. Turner's fever doesn't break soon, and with supplies dwindling, a tense silence fell as the men weighed their options. Finally, Mason spoke up. Let him go, the blacksmith said, surprising everyone. He could have left us to die at the dam. He didn't. That counts for something in my book. Sheriff Parker scowled, but seemed to recognize he was being outmaneuvered. Fine, but he doesn't go alone. I want one of our men with him. I'll accompany Mr. Wolf. The voice came from behind them. Sarah Cooper stood just outside their circle, her blue dress muddied at the hem, but her spine straight as a rail. She'd clearly been listening to their entire conversation. Absolutely not, Reverend Cooper said immediately. This isn't a discussion for women, Sarah. Return to helping with the children. Sarah didn't move. I'm the lightest rider here except for Peter Calloway, who has a broken arm from the dam collapse. Every pound matters on a dangerous trail. And I know the way to Copper Creek as well as anyone. I went with you 3 times last year to pick up mission supplies. This is absurd, her father sputtered. Sheriff, tell her she has a point about the weight, Mason interrupted. And if Wolf tries anything... The threat was left hanging, but understood by all. Elijah said nothing, watching the steel in Sarah's eyes as she faced down her father and the town's leadership. It was clear now why she'd appeared. She'd heard them, planning to send riders, and had prepared her arguments in advance. The preacher's meek daughter wasn't so meek after all. I forbid it, Reverend Cooper said, his voice hardening. As your father and your spiritual guide, I forbid it. With respect, Father, we're discussing the survival of our entire community. Sarah replied, her tone somehow both deferential and immovable. This isn't about what's proper, but what's necessary. Dr. Abernathy cleared his throat. Matthew, she does make practical sense. 2 lighter riders would move faster than Mason and Jenkins. And would you send your daughter out alone with him? Reverend Cooper demanded, jabbing a finger toward Elijah. I have no daughter, the doctor said quietly. But if I did, and it meant saving lives, yes, I believe I would. The Reverend turned to Sheriff Parker, clearly expecting an ally, but the lawman was studying Sarah with grudging assessment. She can handle herself better than most, Parker admitted. Saw her outshoot half the men at last year's July festival. And Wolf knows that if anything happens to her, he'll never draw another breath once I find him. Elijah had remained silent throughout the exchange, but now he spoke directly to Sarah. The trail is dangerous in the best conditions. Now, with the ground saturated, it'll be worse. Are you certain? I am, she said, meeting his gaze without hesitation. He nodded once, then turned back to the group. We'll leave at first light. Need to gather supplies, prepare the horses. Reverend Cooper's face had darkened to a thunderous shade. This meeting is not concluded. I have not given my permission. It's not yours to give, Matthew, Judge Hollister said, his aged voice carrying surprising authority. The girl is of age, and this is a matter of community survival. The motion to send Wolf and Miss Cooper to Copper Creek for aid is carried by majority vote. The finality in the judge's tone left no room for further argument. The Reverend glared at each man in turn, lingering longest on Elijah before storming away. Well, that went about as well as expected, Mayor Wilson muttered. Wolf, Miss Cooper, gather what you need. The rest of us will see to the camp. As the group dispersed, Sarah approached Elijah. Thank you for not objecting to my coming along. I've learned not to stand in the way of someone who knows their own mind, he replied. A small smile touched her lips. Unlike most men in Redemption Creek. Her expression grew serious. My father will try to prevent this. Be ready to leave. Before dawn, not at first light, Elijah raised an eyebrow. You'd defy him openly. To save lives? Yes. She glanced toward where her father had disappeared among the makeshift shelters. He sees the world as he wishes it to be, not as it is. Sometimes that's a gift, other times it's dangerous. With that cryptic assessment, she turned and walked away, her slender figure soon lost among the crowded graves and huddled survivors. Elijah made his way back to where he'd tethered Thunder. The stallion greeted him with a soft whicker, seemingly untroubled by the chaos around them. Animals understood natural disasters differently than humans. They lacked the capacity for existential despair, for imagining destroyed futures, for blaming gods or fate or each other. They simply endured, adapted, survived. We ride before dawn, he told the horse, stroking its muscled neck. With company. Thunder's ears flicked forward, as if considering this information. The preacher's daughter, Elijah continued, checking the saddle for any damage from their earlier hard ride. Stubborn woman. Reminds me of someone. He didn't say who, but Hannah Miller's face floated in his memory, another woman who'd stood her ground when others expected compliance. The comparison unsettled him. Hannah's courage had led to tragedy. Would Sarah's do the same? The night deepened around the cemetery hill. Campfires flickered like fallen stars among the graves. Parents sang quietly to frightened children. The elderly huddled under blankets, their weathered faces contemplating a second displacement in their lifetimes. Young men kept watch at the hill's edges, though what they were watching for, none could say. The flood had no malice, no intent, only the mindless persistence of water seeking its level. Elijah found a spot beneath an old oak tree, away from the main encampment. He spread his bedroll on the driest patch of ground he could find, and sat with his back against the trunk, hat tilted low over his eyes. He didn't expect to sleep much, but he needed rest for the journey ahead. Mr. Wolf. He looked up to find Sarah standing before him, a bundle in her arms. Gone was the blue dress, replaced by riding clothes, men's trousers, a simple shirt, and a worn leather jacket that hung too large on her frame. Her hair was braided and tucked beneath a hat, giving her a boyish appearance at first glance. though no one looking closely would mistake her for male. "You should be resting," he said. "I brought supplies." She knelt, unwrapping the bundle to reveal jerky, hard biscuits, a canteen, and a small medical kit. "It's not much, but it's what I could gather without raising questions." "Your father will." "Notice those clothes," Sarah shrugged. "They were my brother's before he left for the war. Father never goes into his room, so they won't be missed." She hesitated, then sat beside him, though keeping a proper distance. "May I ask you something?" Elijah nodded once. "Why did you really come back to Redemption Creek? And don't say supplies. There are a dozen towns between here and Montana where you could have restocked." He studied her in the darkness, weighing how much to reveal. There was something in her directness that demanded honesty in return. "I came to bury something," he said finally. "Something or someone." Her voice was soft but persistent. A memory, a version of the truth that wasn't true. He shifted, uncomfortable with the admission. "What do you know about the Miller incident?" Sarah drew her knees up, wrapping her arms around them. "That you were taken in by the Miller family as a boy. That there was a fire at their home. Hannah Miller and her parents died and you disappeared the same night. People said you killed them. And you believed that?" "I was 15. I believed what I was told." She tilted her head slightly. "Now I'm not so sure. If you were a murderer, why come back? Why risk yourself for people who hate you?" "Maybe I am a murderer," he said, his voice low. "Maybe I just kill selectively." Sarah didn't flinch from his harsh words. "I don't think so. I've seen men kill for pleasure. My father ministered to condemned men in Yuma prison before we came. Here, you don't have those eyes. You read your eyes now, Miss Cooper? When it matters." She stood, brushing dirt from her borrowed trousers. "We leave an hour before dawn. I'll meet you here." As she turned to go, Elijah spoke again. "Why are you really doing this? It's not just about saving the town." Sarah paused, her back to him. For a long moment she was silent. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight beyond her years. "Because every day in this town is like drowning by inches. Because I've watched good people twist themselves into cruelty in the name of righteousness. Because sometimes—" She looked back at him, her face half-shadowed in the darkness. "Sometimes salvation comes from unexpected places." With that she walked away, leaving Elijah to ponder her words and the journey that lay ahead. Behind him, the oak tree creaked in a gentle breeze, the first wind not carrying rain since the storm began. Above, stars pierced the clearing sky, indifferent to the flood, the town, the tangled histories of those trying to survive below. Morning would come soon enough, bringing with it a path forward, narrow, treacherous, but possible. For now, that was enough. Stars still glimmered in the pre-dawn sky when Elijah Wolfe awoke. He hadn't truly slept, more dozed, alert to every sound, every shift in the wind. Years on the run had taught him the survival value of light sleep. He rose silently, gathering his few possessions and the supplies Sarah had brought. Thunder stood nearby, already saddled and ready, as if the horse sensed the importance of their mission. The cemetery was quiet, most of the refugees still wrapped in exhausted slumber. Only 2 sentries kept watch at the perimeter, and they were stationed on the opposite side of the hill, eyes fixed on the flooded valley below rather than the ridge behind. Elijah moved like a shadow among the graves, leading Thunder by the reins to avoid the noise of mounting. When he reached their agreed meeting spot beneath the oak, Sarah was already waiting. She stood beside a sorrel mare, not as powerful as Thunder, but fine-boned and alert. The animal snorted softly as Elijah approached. "You're late," Sarah whispered, though he was precisely on time. "Your father?" Elijah asked, securing his bedroll behind Thunder's saddle, still sleeping. "I left a note." She patted the saddlebag on her mount. "We should go. The ridge narrows 2 miles north. We need to cross it before full light reveals our position. Elijah raised an eyebrow at her tactical thinking, but didn't comment. They led their horses along the backside of the cemetery, using the tree line for cover until they reached the northern slope where the ridge extended like a finger into the wilderness. The flooding had transformed the landscape into something alien. Where once farms and woods had stood, now a vast lake shimmered in the faint starlight. The trail ahead, barely visible in the best of times, clung to the spine of the ridge like a last hope, in places barely wider than a horse's stride. "I'll lead," Elijah said as they prepared to mount. "Stay at least 10 feet back. If Thunder slips or hesitates, stop immediately." Sarah nodded, swinging into her saddle with practiced ease that surprised him. Not many preachers' daughters rode astride with such confidence. But then, Sarah Cooper had already proven herself. Far from typical. "What's her name?" Elijah asked, nodding toward the mare. "Promise," Sarah replied. "My brother named her before he left, said she was a promise he'd return." Her voice held no emotion, but the absence itself spoke volumes. "Did he?" "No." Sarah adjusted her hat, pulling it lower as the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern sky. "Are we going or talking family history?" Elijah mounted Thunder and urged the stallion forward without another word. The trail immediately demanded his full attention. Muddy, treacherous, bordered on one side by a steep drop to flood waters below, on the other by rocky inclines too steep for a horse to climb. Thunder picked his way carefully, ears forward, muscles tense with concentration. Behind him, Sarah and Promise followed, keeping the prescribed distance. The mare seemed to understand the danger, placing her hooves precisely where Thunder's had been. For nearly an hour, they moved in silence, broken only by the soft clink of tack and the occasional call of a bird awakening to the new day. As the sky brightened from black to deep blue to the rose gold of sunrise, the full extent of the flood became visible. The entire valley lay underwater, a vast inland sea, dotted with the tops of trees and the occasional roof. In the far distance, the broken dam was barely visible, a jagged tear in the landscape. "It's worse than I thought," Sarah said, breaking the silence as they paused on a slightly wider section of trail. "The entire Thompson farm is gone, and look, the water's reached the base of the church hill." Elijah nodded grimly. "Another day of this, and even the cemetery hill might not be high enough. We need to make Copper Creek by nightfall." They pressed on as the sun climbed higher, its heat drawing mist from the floodwaters below. The going was painfully slow. What should have been an hour's ride in normal conditions stretched to 3, as they navigated washouts and slippery sections where the trail had nearly disintegrated. Near midday, they reached the narrowest part of the ridge, a spine of rock barely 4 feet wide, extending 50 yards before widening again into safer terrain. Elijah dismounted, studying the passage with a critical eye. "We walk the horses, here one at a time," he said. "I'll go first with Thunder, then come back for Promise." Sarah slid from her saddle, frowning. "Promise won't cross with a stranger leading her. She barely tolerates my father, and she's known him for years." "You expect to lead her across that?" Elijah gestured to the treacherous path. "One wrong step and you both go over." "I expect to trust my horse and myself," she replied evenly. "Just as you trust Thunder." Elijah recognized the set of her jaw, the same stubborn determination she'd shown at the town meeting. Arguing would waste precious time they didn't have. "Your funeral," he muttered, taking Thunder's reins. "Wait until I'm completely across before you start." The crossing was nerve-wracking even for Elijah, who'd navigated similar terrain in Apache country. The rock was slick from the recent rains, and parts of the path had crumbled away, leaving barely enough room for Thunder's hooves. The stallion was tense but obedient, moving with exquisite care, guided by Elijah's soft commands and the light pressure of the reins. When they finally reached the wider section on the far side, Elijah let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned to call back to Sarah, only to find she'd already started across, ignoring his instruction to wait. She moved with the same calm precision as before, one hand on Promise's reins, the other sometimes steadying herself against the mare's shoulder. The horse seemed to sense the danger, placing each hoof with deliberate care, nostrils flared but eyes steady. Elijah watched, tension knotting his shoulders as they navigated the narrowest section. In one heart-stopping moment, loose stones clattered away under Promise's hoof, dropping into the flood far below. The mare tensed, freezing in place. Sarah murmured something Elijah couldn't hear, her hand gentle on the horse's neck. After a breathless second, Promise continued forward. When they finally reached him, Elijah didn't bother hiding his irritation. "I said wait. And waste more daylight?" Sarah shook her head. "We can't afford delays. We can't afford a dead messenger." "Either," he countered. "Next time, follow instructions." A hint of a smile touched her lips. "Is that what you did 10 years ago? Followed instructions?" The question hung between them, sharp as a knife point. Elijah turned away without answering, checking Thunder's saddle before mounting again. Sarah did the same, and they continued along the ridge, which now widened enough to ride side by side when the terrain allowed. As the day progressed, the landscape gradually changed. The ridge rose higher, connecting to the foothills of the mountains that framed the western horizon. The flooding was less severe here, the waters a distant silver shimmer behind them. Trees grew denser, mostly pine and spruce that had withstood the heavy rains better than the cottonwoods and willows of the valley. They stopped briefly to rest the horses and eat some of the jerky Sarah had brought. The sun was high overhead, now warm but not oppressive. In another life it might have been a pleasant day for a ride. "Tell me about the Millers," Sarah said abruptly, breaking the long silence. Elijah stiffened. "Why?" "Because whatever happened that night is the reason. You came back, isn't it? And it's why the town hates you. Seems like something I should know if I'm trusting you with my life." He took a long drink from his canteen, buying time to consider his response. The truth had been buried for so long, weighted down by lies and half-truths, that excavating it felt dangerous, like digging up a grave. "John Miller found me when I was 12, he said finally, his voice low. "I was half-starved, sleeping in his barn. My mother had died the year before. Smallpox. My father was already long gone. Miller could have sent me to an orphanage or turned me over to the sheriff. Instead, he gave me a home." Sarah watched him, her green eyes intent. "That doesn't sound like a man you'd want to kill." It wasn't. Elijah's jaw tightened. "John Miller was the finest man I've ever known. He taught me everything, how to track, shoot, break horses, read the weather. He treated me like a son, even though most of the town thought he was crazy for taking in a half-breed." "What about Mrs. Miller?" "Martha was kind in her way, more reserved than John. She worried what people thought, but she never mistreated me, never made me feel unwelcome." "And Hannah?" Sarah's voice softened on the name. "She would have been about my age now." Elijah's expression darkened. "Hannah was 19 when I was 17. Beautiful, headstrong, the kind of girl who knew her own mind." His eyes flickered briefly to Sarah's face. "She wanted to be a doctor. Her father supported it, but her mother thought it improper. And then there was Edmund Blackwood." "The banker's son?" Sarah asked. "He moved away years ago, after the fire." Elijah nodded. "Blackwood wanted Hannah, not as a wife, though that's what he told her parents. She refused him. He didn't take it well." Sarah frowned. "What does this have to do with the fire? With you leaving?" Elijah stood abruptly. "We should move, still a long way to Copper Creek." He strode to Thunder, effectively ending the conversation. Sarah didn't press further, but as they mounted and continued their journey, he could feel her gaze on him, thoughtful and assessing. The afternoon brought new challenges. The trail wound down from the ridge into more heavily wooded terrain, where fallen trees and washed-out stream beds forced frequent detours. At one particularly bad crossing, where a creek had swollen to 10 times its normal size, they lost nearly an hour finding a safe place to ford. By late afternoon, dark clouds had gathered again on the horizon, threatening more rain. Elijah pushed their pace as much as the difficult terrain allowed, conscious of the fading daylight and the distance still to cover. "We won't reach Copper Creek by nightfall," Sarah observed as the shadows lengthened. "Not at this rate." "There's a line shack about 3 miles ahead," Elijah replied. "Used by hunters and trappers. If it's still standing, we can shelter there for the night." Sarah nodded, seemingly untroubled by the prospect of spending a night alone in the wilderness with a man her town considered a murderer. Either she was remarkably brave or remarkably foolish. Elijah wasn't sure which. The rain held off, but darkness fell quickly under the heavy cloud cover. They navigated the last mile by instinct more than sight, the horses picking their way carefully. Through the gloom, when the squat outline of the line shack finally appeared in a small clearing, Elijah felt relief wash through him. "Wait here," he told Sarah, dismounting. "Let me check it first." The shack was crude but solid, a single room built of logs with a dirt floor and a stone fireplace. The roof had held against the recent storms, though water had seeped under the door, leaving the floor muddy. A quick inspection revealed no current occupants, human or animal. "It's clear," he called to Sarah, who led both horses to the lean-to attached to one side of the shack. As she began unsaddling them, Elijah gathered firewood from the small stack against the back wall. Soon a fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the rough walls. They worked in companionable silence, Sarah arranging their bedrolls on opposite sides of the small room, while Elijah prepared a simple meal from their supplies. The domesticity of it felt strange to him, accustomed as he was to solitary camps and silent nights. "You never finished the story," Sarah said as they sat before the fire, warming their hands around tin cups of coffee. "About the Millers. About why you left." Elijah stared into the flames. Part of him wanted to deflect again, to bury the past where it couldn't hurt anyone. But another part, a part he'd thought long dead, wanted her to know the truth. Wanted someone to know. "Blackwood came to the house that night," he said, his voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "Drunk, angry. Hannah had publicly rejected him that afternoon at church. Said she'd rather die a spinster than marry a man who thought women belonged in the kitchen and bedroom only." Sarah's expression didn't change, but her knuckles whitened around her cup. "John and Martha were in town at a church meeting. Hannah and I were alone at the house. Blackwood barged in, demanding to speak to her. When she refused to see him, he became violent." Elijah's jaw clenched at the memory. "I heard the commotion from the barn where I was working. By the time I reached the house, he had her cornered in the kitchen." "What did you do?" Sarah asked. Softly. "What any brother would do. I pulled him off her, told her to run for help. Blackwood drew a knife. We fought. The lantern got knocked over." Elijah's eyes grew distant, seeing not the fire before him, but the inferno of that night. The flames spread so fast. Hannah ran upstairs to save some family heirlooms. Blackwood ran out the front door. I tried to reach Hannah, but the stairs collapsed. I could hear her screaming. He fell silent, the memory too raw to continue. "You couldn't save her," Sarah said. "Not a question, but a statement. I tried to go in through her window, climbed the oak tree outside, but by then—" He shook his head. "When John and Martha returned, the house was engulfed. They rushed inside, trying to reach Hannah. None of them came out. And Blackwood, what happened to him? He told the town I started the fire in a rage when the Millers threatened to throw me out. Said I'd been stealing from them, that I attacked him when he caught me. The perfect story, the savage half-breed turning on his benefactors." Elijah's voice held no bitterness, only a deep, old weariness. Sheriff Parker formed a posse. I ran. Sarah set down her cup, her face pale in the firelight. Why come back now, after all these years? I tracked Blackwood to Santa Fe last month, found him dying of consumption in a flophouse. He confessed. What really happened that night? Said he couldn't die with it on his soul. Elijah finally looked up, meeting her gaze. I came back to clear my name, to visit their graves, to make peace with the past. Does anyone in town know this? No. And who would believe me if I told them? A killer's word against a dead man's reputation. He shook his head. Some truths aren't meant to be heard. Outside, rain began to fall, pattering softly on the roof. The horses shifted in the lean-to, settling for the night. Inside, the fire popped and hissed, casting their shadows large against the wall. Two figures separated by space, but connected by the sharing of a truth long buried. I believe you, Sarah said simply. The words hung in the air between them, small but weighty. Elijah didn't respond, but something in his posture eased slightly, a tension released. Hannah wanted to be more than what Redemption Creek would allow, Sarah said after a moment of silence. Just like I do. Elijah looked up at her, studying her face in the dancing firelight. What is it you want to be? A doctor. Her voice gained strength as she spoke the dream aloud. Not just a midwife tolerated out of necessity, but a true physician with the education and respect that comes with it. There's a women's medical college in Philadelphia. I've kept the newspaper clipping about it for 3 years now. Your father knows. She shook her head, a sad smile touching her lips. He found it once, tucked in my Bible, said it was vanity to aspire beyond my station, that God had ordained women for certain roles and men for others. Her fingers absently traced patterns on the rough floorboards beside her. When I argued, he quoted scripture until I had no words left. Yet you still kept the clipping, Elijah observed. Hidden in the lining of my winter boots, she admitted. A flash of mischief in her eyes. Even the most righteous father doesn't check there. The small act of rebellion seemed to encapsulate everything about her. The proper preacher's daughter on the surface, the determined woman beneath. Elijah felt a sudden, unexpected kinship with her that went beyond their shared ordeal. John Miller would have approved, he said quietly. He believed people should become what they were meant to be, not what others decided for them. That's why he took me in when everyone said a half Apache boy would bring nothing but trouble. He sounds like a wise man. He was. Elijah's voice softened with memory. When I first came to live with them, I barely spoke. Not because I couldn't, but because I'd learned that silence was safer. John never pushed, just included me in everything, taught me to track, hunt, care for the horses, let me find my voice in my own time. And Hannah, what was she like, truly? Sarah asked, her curiosity genuine rather than prying. Elijah hesitated, then reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a small, worn photograph. He passed it to Sarah, who examined it in the firelight. The image showed a young woman with dark hair, framing a heart-shaped face, her expression serious but with a hint of defiance in her eyes. She wore a plain dress, but her posture suggested someone who chafed against constraints. She looked strong, Sarah observed, handing the photograph back. She was stubborn as a mule, John used to say, never took no for an answer. A rare smile crossed Elijah's face. When she decided to become a doctor, she ordered medical textbooks without telling her parents, hid them under her bed and studied, by candlelight after everyone was asleep. What happened when they found out? John laughed and said he'd known all along. Told her if she was serious, he'd find a way to send her to medical school, no matter what the town thought. The smile faded. Martha was harder to convince, worried about Hannah's reputation, her marriage prospects. But she was coming around, bit by bit, until Blackwood, Sarah said softly. Elijah nodded, his expression darkening. He was the banker's son, used to getting what he wanted. When Hannah rejected him publicly, it wasn't just her he wanted to hurt, but her entire family, including me, the half-breed they'd taken in over the objections of decent folks like his father. A log shifted in the fire, sending sparks spiraling upward. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming steadily on the roof. After the fire, Elijah continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, I rode for 3 days without stopping. Didn't know where I was going, just knew I couldn't stay. Ended up in Apache country, where my mother's people took me in. Lived with them for 2 years before moving on again. And all this time, you carried the truth alone, Sarah said, her eyes reflecting the firelight as she regarded him. The burden of knowing what really happened while being blamed for it. Truth doesn't count for much when no one wants to hear it, he replied. I learned to live with what people believed about me, easier than fighting it, until now. It wasn't a question, until Blackwood's confession, until the flood. His eyes met hers across the small space separating them. Until you. The admission seemed to surprise him as much as her. Sarah held his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. Recognition, understanding, possibility. We should sleep, he said after a long moment, breaking the spell. Dawn comes early, and we still have hard riding ahead. Sarah nodded, moving to her bedroll. As she settled beneath her blanket, her voice came once more through the darkness, soft but clear. Thank you for telling me. Elijah lay on his own bedroll, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling. The rain continued its gentle rhythm, a counterpoint to the crackling fire. In the shadows of the small cabin, something had shifted, not just between them, but within him. A secret shared was a burden halved, his Apache grandmother had once told him. Perhaps she had been right. Dawn arrived with clearing skies and a sense of urgency. The overnight rain had been gentle, but enough to remind them that nature's temperament remained unpredictable. Elijah woke before first light, rekindling the fire and checking on the horses, while Sarah still slept. When she finally stirred, he had coffee brewing in a battered pot he'd found hanging in the cabin. How long until Copper Creek? She asked, accepting a steaming cup with murmured thanks. If the trails are passable, we could reach it by midday, Elijah replied, packing away their meager supplies. From there, it's another hour to the railroad station. Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful as she sipped her coffee. The revelation of Elijah's past seemed to linger between them, not a barrier anymore, but a shared confidence that had altered something fundamental in their understanding of each other. What will you do? She asked suddenly. After we bring help back to Redemption Creek, will you stay? Elijah paused in his work, considering the question. Why would I? The truth about the Millers won't change how the town feels. Some stories are too comfortable to surrender, especially when they confirm what people already want to believe. You could try, Sarah persisted. With Blackwood's confession, a deathbed confession, with no witnesses except the accused? Elijah shook his head. Even if Parker believed me, which he won't, the town has spent 10 years seeing me as a killer. That kind of judgment doesn't wash away easily. So you'll just leave again? Let the lie stand? There was a challenge in her voice, soft but unmistakable. Elijah's jaw tightened. I came back to make peace with my past, not to change it. Those aren't the same thing. They're the only things possible. He shouldered his pack. We should move. The horses are rested. Sarah didn't press further, but as they saddled the mounts and prepared to leave, Elijah could feel her studying him, not with judgment, but with a quiet assessment that somehow felt more unsettling. The morning air was crisp, the world washed, clean by the night's rain. They made good time along a game trail that wound through stands of pine and across small meadows bright with wildflowers. In another context, it might have been idyllic. The flood seemed distant here, a calamity belonging to another world. "I've never been this far from town alone," Sarah admitted as they paused to water the horses at a clear stream. "Father always insisted on escorts, usually Deacon Phillips or one of my cousins." "Why did he let you go to the Turners alone then?" Elijah asked. "That seems unlike him." A shadow crossed her face. "He didn't know. I told him I was visiting Mrs. Henderson to help with her newborn, but when word came about Mrs. Turner's difficult labor..." She shrugged. "I'm the only midwife within 10 miles since Dr. Abernathy's wife died." "You're a midwife?" Elijah's surprise was evident. "I thought you were just the preacher's daughter." "I'm never just anything, Mr. Wolf." There was a hint of steel beneath her polite tone. "I've delivered 12 babies in Redemption Creek. Father permits it because it's women's work and because the town needs someone with the skill. But he doesn't know I've been studying Dr. Abernathy's medical books. He thinks a woman doctor is unnatural." Elijah nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. "Like Hannah Miller." "Yes." Sarah's eyes met his. "That's why your story rang true to me. I recognized Hannah in your words, another woman who wanted more than the narrow life laid out for her." There was something in her gaze that made Elijah look away first. He busied himself checking Thunder's saddle girth, uncomfortable with the parallel she'd drawn. "We should reach the main trail to Copper Creek by noon," he said, changing the subject. "The going will be easier then." They mounted and continued their journey. The silence between them now waited with unspoken thoughts. The landscape gradually changed as they descended from the foothills, pine forests giving way to more open country dotted with scrub oak and sage. By mid-morning, they could see the distant smudge of smoke that marked Copper Creek. "Someone's coming," Sarah said suddenly, pointing ahead where the trail emerged from a stand of trees. Elijah reined in Thunder, his hand dropping instinctively to his revolver. 3 riders appeared on the trail, moving at a brisk trot toward them. As they drew closer, Sarah gasped. "That's my father," she said, her voice tight with disbelief. "And Sheriff Parker. And is that Mason?" Indeed, the 3 men approaching were Reverend Cooper, Sheriff Parker, and the blacksmith, all armed and wearing expressions that ranged from grim determination to barely contained fury. They spotted Elijah and Sarah at the same moment, spurring. "Their horses forward. Move behind me," Elijah told Sarah quietly. "No," she replied, urging Promise forward to draw even with Thunder. "I won't hide." Reverend Cooper reached them first, his normally composed face twisted with rage and relief. "Sarah, thank God!" He turned cold eyes on Elijah. "Step away from my daughter, Wolf." Sheriff Parker drew his pistol, training it on Elijah with deadly intent. "You're under arrest for kidnapping." "Kidnapping?" Sarah's voice rose in disbelief. "I left of my own free will. There was a note he forced you to write." "No." "A doubt," her father cut in. "It's all right, Sarah, you're safe now." "I was never in danger," she protested. "We were on our way to Copper Creek to get help for the town. The council approved." "The council was misled," Reverend Cooper said harshly. "This man manipulated them, just as he manipulated you, using the flood as cover for his true intentions." Elijah remained still, hands visible, though tension radiated from his frame. "How did you find us?" he asked Parker. The sheriff's mouth twisted in a grim smile. "Not as clever as you think, Wolf. Mason here knows these hills even better than you do. Figured you'd take the ridge trail. We rode through the night to catch up." Mason sat silently on his horse, his expression unreadable. Unlike the others, his weapon remained holstered. "This is absurd," Sarah said, anger replacing her initial shock. "Sheriff, I told you I volunteered for this mission. Father, I left you a note explicitly stating I was going to Copper Creek with Mr. Wolf to get help. A note I found torn up and discarded." Reverend Cooper replied. "Obviously planted to mislead us while he took you against your will." Elijah's eyes narrowed. "You tore up her note?" "To protect her reputation," the Reverend said stiffly. "Better. The town thinks she was taken than that she willingly rode off with a murderer." Sarah's face was drained of color. "You lied to the entire town. Made them believe I was kidnapped?" "I did what was necessary," her father said. "Now come here, Sarah. We're taking you home, and Wolf is coming with us," Parker added, cocking his pistol. "In chains this time." Sarah didn't move. No, the single word fell between them like a stone. Reverend Cooper blinked, clearly not expecting defiance. "Sarah, you're confused, frightened. This man has done nothing wrong." She interrupted, her voice steady. "He saved my life during the flood. He warned us about the dam. He's risked himself repeatedly for people who hate him. And now we're going to Copper Creek to get help, just as the council directed." Sheriff Parker's expression darkened. "That's not happening, Miss Cooper. We have orders to bring you both back." "Sheriff," Mason spoke for the first time. "Maybe we should hear them out." Parker glared at him. "You turning soft on outlaws now, Mason?" "I'm thinking about the people back on that hill," the blacksmith replied, "running low on food and medicine. We could let them continue to Copper Creek, bring back supplies and help. While Wolf escapes justice, not a chance." Sarah moved Promise forward, positioning herself between Elijah and the sheriff's gun. "There will be no justice in what you're planning, Sheriff. Only vengeance for a crime that never happened." Parker's eyes widened. "What lies has he been telling you, girl?" "The truth about the Miller fire," she said. "About Edmund Blackwood's role in it. About how Elijah tried to save Hannah, not kill her." Reverend Cooper laughed harshly. "And you believed him? Sarah, I raised you with better sense than to trust the word of a what, father?" Sarah's voice was dangerously soft. "A half-breed? A killer? Or just a man different from you?" An uncomfortable silence fell. Mason shifted in his saddle, looking between the preacher and his daughter with growing unease. "Edmund Blackwood confessed on his deathbed," Sarah continued. "Elijah found him in Santa Fe last month. That's why he came back, to clear his name, not to cause trouble." "Convenient that Blackwood is dead and can't confirm this story," Parker sneered. "Convenient for whom?" Elijah spoke at last. "Not for me. Not for the Millers, whose memory has been twisted to serve a lie." His eyes locked with Parker's. "You never looked for evidence that might prove me innocent, Sheriff. Never questioned why a boy taken in by a family who showed him nothing but kindness would suddenly turn on them. I know what I saw," Parker insisted. "You running from the scene covered in blood." "Hannah's blood," Elijah said quietly, "from trying to reach her through the upstairs window, from the cuts I got breaking the glass. Did you ever wonder why I was outside the house if I started the fire inside?" Parker's gun wavered slightly. Doubt flickered across his weathered face. "Enough of this," Reverend Cooper snapped. "Sarah, come here now. I won't ask again." Sarah straightened in her saddle. "No, Father. I'm going to Copper Creek. The people on that hill need help, and I won't let your pride or the sheriff's vendetta stop me from getting it." "Then you leave me no choice." The Reverend's voice hardened as he turned to Parker. "Sheriff, arrest my daughter for her own protection. She's clearly not in her right mind." Parker hesitated, glancing between father and daughter. "You can't be serious," Mason protested. "Arrest her for what? Trying to save the town?" "For obstruction of justice," Reverend Cooper said coldly, "and for aiding a fugitive." Before Parker could respond, Elijah made his move. In one fluid motion, he drew his revolver and fired, not at the men but into the air. The shot cracked like thunder, startling their horses. As the animals reared and the men struggled for control, he grabbed Sarah's reins. "Ride!" he shouted, spurring Thunder forward. They bolted down the trail, hooves pounding the packed earth as shouts erupted behind them. Sarah kept pace beside him, bent low over Promise's neck as the mare stretched into a gallop. Behind them, Parker fired a wild shot that went wide, followed by the sound of pursuit. The trail split ahead, one fork continuing toward Copper Creek, the other veering west into rougher country. Elijah made a split-second decision, turning. "Thunder toward the western path. Follow me," he called to Sarah. She hesitated only briefly before turning Promise after him. They crashed through brush and over rocky ground, putting distance between themselves and their pursuers. Elijah guided them through increasingly difficult terrain, using every trick he knew to confuse their trail, crossing streams, doubling. Back, riding over stone where hooves left no prints. After nearly an hour of hard riding, they reached a sheltered draw where a spring bubbled up from rocky ground. The horses were lathered and breathing hard, in need of rest. Elijah dismounted, helping Sarah down from her saddle. "Why did we turn away from Copper Creek?" she asked, her face flushed from the ride. "The town still needs help." "And we'll get it for them," Elijah replied, leading the horses to water. "But not from Copper Creek. Your father and Parker will have men watching every approach by now. We need another way." "What other way?" "The railroad at Copper Creek is the only link to the outside world for 50 miles. Elijah shook his head. "Not the only one. There's a telegraph station at the Wilson Mining Company outpost, a day's ride west of here. From there we can wire for help." Sarah considered this, absently stroking Promise's neck as the mare drank. "Father will never stop hunting us now. You know that, don't you? What you did back there, helping me defy him openly, he'll see it as the ultimate betrayal. You could still go back," Elijah said quietly. "Tell them I forced you. They'd believe it." She looked at him steadily, green eyes clear and resolved. "Is that what you want me to do?" "What I want doesn't matter. This is your life, your future in that town." "A future as what? The obedient preacher's daughter, forever living by other people's rules and judgments?" Sarah shook her head. "I made my choice when I volunteered for this mission. I'm not turning back now." Elijah studied her, seeing again the echo of Hannah Miller in her determination. But where Hannah had died for her defiance, he was determined that Sarah would live for hers. "The mining outpost is dangerous," he warned. "Rough men, rougher conditions, nothing like Redemption Creek." A smile touched her lips. "Good. I've had enough of Redemption Creek's particular brand of salvation. And after we get help for the town? What then?" Sarah's smile faded, replaced by a thoughtfulness that aged her beyond her years. "I don't know, but for the first time I feel like I have a choice. That's worth something, isn't it?" Before Elijah could respond, a distant shout echoed from the hills behind them. Their pursuers were still on their trail. "We need to move," he said, helping her remount. "Stay close, and don't look back." As they rode deeper into the wilderness, the sun began its westward descent. Behind them lay everything. Familiar the town, its judgments, its rigid certainties. Ahead lay only questions and the freedom to find their own answers. For Elijah, who had spent 10 years running from the past, it felt strangely like coming home. For Sarah, leaving the only home she'd ever known, it felt like the first true breath. After a lifetime of suffocation, the trail grew faint before them, winding through stands of pine and over rocky ridges. Their shadows stretched long beside them, two figures moving in unison, connected not by the circumstances that had thrown them together, but by the choices that kept them there. Somewhere in the hills behind them, a father raged and a sheriff plotted. But for now, for this moment caught between past and future, they rode free. Dusk settled over the mountains like a purple veil, bringing with it the sharp chill of high country nights. Elijah and Sarah had pushed the horses hard, following game trails and old logging paths that few men remembered. Though they'd seen no sign of pursuit for hours, caution kept them moving until the failing light made further travel dangerous. They made camp in a secluded hollow where a cluster of boulders provided shelter from the wind. Sarah gathered wood, while Elijah tended to the exhausted horses, removing their saddles and rubbing them down with handfuls of grass. The animals had given everything asked of them and more. "How far to the mining outpost?" Sarah asked as they sat before a small, carefully banked fire. The flames cast flickering shadows across her face, highlighting the determination that had replaced her earlier uncertainty. "If we start at first light, we should reach it by mid-afternoon," Elijah replied, offering her a strip of jerky from their dwindling supplies. Assuming the trails haven't washed out, Sarah accepted the food with a nod of thanks. "And if they have, then we improvise." He studied her across the fire. "Having second thoughts?" "No." The answer came quickly, firmly. "But I am thinking about what happens after. The town needs help, medicine, food, perhaps evacuation for the most vulnerable. Even if we send a telegraph tomorrow, it could be days before aid arrives." "You're worried about your father." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "Despite everything, yes, he's still my father. And there are good people in Redemption Creek, whatever their faults. People who've been told I kidnapped the preacher's daughter," Elijah pointed out. "People who already believed I was a killer. Then we'll set the record straight." Her green eyes reflected the firelight as she looked at him steadily. Together, the word hung between them, weighted with implications neither was ready to voice. Elijah turned away, ostensibly to check on the horses again. "You should rest," he said over his shoulder. "Tomorrow won't be easy." Sarah didn't press him, settling onto her bedroll with a quiet dignity that made her seem older than her years. Soon her breathing deepened into the rhythm of sleep, leaving Elijah alone with his thoughts and the vast canopy of stars overhead. He hadn't planned for this, for her. His return to Redemption Creek was supposed to be simple. Visit the millers' graves, perhaps find some evidence of Blackwood's guilt that might clear his name, then vanish back into the territories where a man's past didn't matter as much as his ability to survive the present. The flood had changed everything, washing away not just the physical landscape, but the emotional one as well. Sleep eluded him. Instead, he kept watch through the night, alert for any sign of Parker and his men, for any threat to the woman who had inexplicably placed her trust in him. Thunder nickered softly in the darkness, sensing his restlessness. "I know," Elijah murmured to the horse. "Nothing's simple anymore." Dawn arrived clear and cold, painting the eastern sky in delicate pinks and golds. Sarah woke as the first light, touched their camp, immediately alert and ready to continue their journey. They breakfasted quickly on the last of their provisions, then saddled the horses and set out. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they traveled west. Steep slopes, covered in pine and aspen, deep ravines carved by spring runoff, meadows bright with wildflowers. In another life, under different circumstances, it might have been a pleasant journey through some of the most beautiful country in the territory. But the urgency of their mission and the knowledge of pursuit kept pleasure at bay. By mid-morning, they reached a high ridge that offered a sweeping view of the landscape they'd left behind. Far to the east, the flooded valley stretched like a vast inland sea, the town of Redemption Creek reduced to a few scattered points rising above the water. The cemetery hill stood as an island, crowded with tiny figures, the townspeople still, stranded by the unrelenting flood. "It's worse," Sarah said softly, shading her eyes against the sun. "The water's still rising." Elijah nodded grimly. "All the more reason to reach the telegraph station. They need help sooner rather than later." They pressed on, descending into a steep, walled canyon where a stream, swollen by the recent rains, rushed over smooth stones. The trail narrowed dangerously, forcing them to dismount and lead the horses through treacherous stretches where one misstep could mean disaster. "Watch your footing," Elijah warned as they navigated a particularly narrow section. "The rock is—" His warning came too late. Sarah's boots slipped on wet stone, sending her stumbling toward the edge where the ground fell away steeply to the stream below. Elijah lunged forward, catching her arm just as she began to fall. For a heart-stopping moment they teetered on. The brink, gravity pulling them toward the rushing water 20 feet below. Then Elijah's strength prevailed. He hauled her back onto solid ground, both of them breathing hard from the near disaster. Sarah steadied herself against him, her hands gripping his arms. "Thank you," she gasped, still shaken. "Seems like I'm always pulling you out of water." He replied, attempting to lighten the moment. She looked up at him, suddenly aware of their proximity. "Maybe it's fate." "I don't believe in fate," Elijah said, but he didn't step away. "What do you believe in?" The question hung between them, intimate and challenging. Before he could answer, the distant sound of voices echoed down the canyon. They froze, listening. "Must have come this way," a man's voice called, faint but unmistakable. "Parker," Elijah whispered. He turned to the horses, quickly gathering their reins. "We need to move, now!" They hurried along the trail, no longer concerned with being quiet. Speed mattered more than stealth now. The canyon widened ahead, offering multiple paths forward. Elijah chose the steepest, hoping the difficult terrain would slow their pursuers. For 2 hours they pushed on, climbing higher into the mountains, where the air grew thin and cold. The voices faded behind them, but Elijah knew better than to assume they'd lost Parker's posse. The sheriff was nothing if not persistent, a quality that might have been admirable in a man less consumed by prejudice and pride. By early afternoon, signs of human activity began to appear. A felled tree cut with an axe, a rough trail widened for wagons, the occasional glint of metal among the rocks where prospectors had tested for ore. The Wilson Mining Company outpost couldn't be far. They crested a ridge and finally saw it, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in a natural bowl between the mountains. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and the clang of metal on metal echoed up from what appeared to be a blacksmith shop. On the largest building, a telegraph wire stretched from a tall pole running down the mountain towards civilization. "We made it," Sarah said, relief evident in her voice. "Not quite," Elijah cautioned. "Mining camps aren't known for their hospitality, especially to strangers who arrive unannounced." They approached cautiously, staying within the tree line until they could assess the situation. The camp was busy, with midday activity. Miners coming and going from a mess hall, wagons being loaded with ore, a group of men repairing what looked like pump equipment. "Wait here," Elijah told Sarah. "Let me find out who's in charge." "I'm coming with you," she insisted. "A woman alone in a mining camp draws attention we don't need right now." Sarah's chin lifted stubbornly. "I'm not alone. I'm with you." Again that word, with carrying implications that unsettled and intrigued him in equal measure. Elijah recognized the futility of arguing with her and simply nodded, leading the way down toward the outpost. They had barely reached the edge of the camp when they were spotted. A burly man with a thick beard raised the alarm, and within moments they were surrounded by miners with pickaxes and a few revolvers. "State your business," demanded an older man with a scar running from his left eye to jaw. Clearly someone in authority. "We need to send a telegraph," Elijah said calmly, keeping his hands visible and away from his weapon. "It's urgent." The scarred man's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "You've come a long way just to send a wire. Who are you running from?" "No one," Sarah interjected before Elijah could respond. "We're from Redemption Creek. The town's been flooded. People are stranded, running out of food and medicine. We need to summon help." The mention of the flood changed the atmosphere immediately. Several of the miners lowered their weapons. Heard about that, the scarred man said. Bad business. Wilson himself sent men to check the pass, but it was completely underwater. He studied them more carefully. You two made it through. We took the high ridge, Elijah explained. Not an easy route. The man nodded slowly, coming to a decision. Name's Harker. I run this outpost when Wilson's away. He gestured toward the largest building. Telegraph is inside. You can use it, but it'll cost you. We have little money, Sarah admitted. But I'm a skilled midwife and have some medical knowledge. Your camp could use such services, I imagine. Harker's expression shifted from suspicion to grudging respect. That it could. We lost our doctor last winter to pneumonia. He glanced at Elijah. And him? I know horses, Elijah said simply. And I can hunt. After a moment's consideration, Harker nodded. Fair enough. Send your wire. We can discuss payment after. They were led to the company office where a young man operated the telegraph. Sarah quickly composed a message addressing the flood situation, requesting immediate aid from the territorial governor's office and the nearest military outpost. The telegrapher's fingers flew over the key, translating her urgent plea into the dots and dashes that would bring help to Redemption Creek. It's done, the telegrapher announced when he finished. Reply might take some time, though. Harker, who had watched the whole process with arms crossed, now approached them. You're welcome to wait here for a response, but I should warn you, we had riders earlier today asking about a half Apache man and a woman matching your description. Elijah tensed. Sheriff Parker didn't give names, Harker replied, but they were offering a reward for information, said the woman had been kidnapped. That's a lie, Sarah said firmly. I left willingly to seek help for our town. Harker studied, her face, then Elijah's. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him. Not my business, either way. Wilson Mining Company doesn't get involved in local disputes, but those men might circle back this way eventually. We understand, Elijah said. Thank you for the warning. They were given a small cabin on the outpost's edge to rest and wait for a response to their telegraph. The single room was spartanly furnished. 2 narrow cots, a rough table with 2 chairs, a pot-bellied stove for heat and cooking, but after days on the trail, it felt luxurious. Sarah sat by the window, watching the activity in the camp, while Elijah built a fire in the stove. The domesticity of the scene struck her suddenly. How natural it felt to share this space with him, how quickly her world had transformed from the rigid confines of the preacher's house to this wild uncertainty. What are you thinking? Elijah asked, noticing her contemplative expression. That everything has changed, she replied honestly. In just a few days, my entire life has been washed away, like the town. Regrets? She considered the question carefully. No. Fear, yes. Uncertainty, by what comes next, but not regret. Elijah nodded, understanding in his dark eyes. He'd lived with uncertainty for years, carrying his innocence like a secret burden, denied the chance to grieve properly for those he'd loved and lost. A knock at the door interrupted their moment of quiet connection. Harker entered without waiting. For a response, a piece of paper in his weathered hand. Telegraph came back, he announced, handing the paper to Sarah. Army sending men and supplies from Fort Collins. Should reach Redemption Creek within 2 days, if the weather holds. Relief washed over her face as she read the message. Thank you. This will save lives. Harker shifted uncomfortably. There's something else. Those riders I mentioned. They've been spotted headed this way. Should reach us by nightfall. Elijah's expression hardened. Parker doesn't give up easily. That's why I'm telling you now, Harker said. Gives you time to decide what you want to do. After the foreman left, silence filled the small cabin. The late afternoon sun slanted through the window, painting golden rectangles on the rough plank floor. Outside, the normal sounds of the mining camp continued. Men calling to each other, the creak of wagon wheels, the distant thump of ore being processed. "We could leave," Elijah said finally. "Head west to Montana Territory like I planned. No one would blame you after what your father did." Sarah moved from the window to stand before him. "Is that what you want?" "What I want." He hesitated, the words unfamiliar on his tongue. For so long, wants had been luxuries he couldn't afford. Survival had been his only goal. "What I want is to stop running, to face the truth and make others face it too. Then we go back," she said simply, "together." "It won't be easy," he warned. "Parker won't accept the truth willingly, neither will your father. Some truths demand to be heard, whether welcome or not." She smiled slightly. "A preacher's daughter knows that better than most." Elijah studied her face, the quiet strength there, the determination that matched his own. "You're certain?" "I am." Her hand found his, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. "The flood's waters are receding, Elijah, but what they've revealed can't be buried again." He didn't pull away, instead interlacing his fingers with hers. The contact was simple, human, profound, a connection neither had expected to find in the chaos of disaster. "Then we face them," he agreed. "But not as fugitives. We wait for Parker here, with witnesses who've heard our story and seen the telegraph. We make him take us back to a town already receiving help because of our actions." Sarah nodded, understanding his strategy. "They'll have to listen then. The truth will have witnesses." As the sun began its descent behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the mining camp, they made their preparations. Not to flee, but to stand their ground, together against whatever judgment came with the morning. Outside their cabin window, the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of evening. Somewhere back in Redemption Creek, people looked at those same stars, perhaps praying for salvation that was already on its way. The flood that had nearly destroyed them had also washed away old barriers, old lies, creating space for new truths and unexpected grace. Sarah stood by the window, her silhouette framed against the last light of day. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about wanting to stop running." Elijah looked up from where he was checking his revolver. "And my whole life I've been running too, in a different way." She turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. "Running from what I truly wanted, convincing myself that duty and obedience were enough, that the small freedoms Father allowed were all I could hope for." "What changed?" "The flood. You." She smiled slightly. "Facing death has a way of clarifying what matters. When I was caught in that river, I remember thinking not about the life I'd lived, but about the one I hadn't dared to live." Elijah set his gun aside and rose to join her at the window. Outside, lanterns were being lit around the mining camp, points of gold in the gathering darkness. "I found this in one of the saddlebags," Sarah said, holding out a folded piece of newspaper. "It must have been tucked in with the supplies." Elijah took it, opening the brittle page carefully. It was a clipping from the Copper Creek Gazette, dated 3 weeks earlier. The headline read, "Women's Medical College announces expansion, scholarships for Western Territories." "It seems like a sign," Sarah said softly. "Don't you think?" "I don't believe in signs," he replied, handing the clipping back to her. "But I do believe in making choices when opportunities present themselves. What if my choice is to go east, to become Dr. Cooper instead of Reverend Cooper's obedient daughter?" Her green eyes searched his face. "What would your choice be, Elijah Wolfe, if you were truly free to make it?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. For a moment, he was silent, considering all the paths his life might have taken, all the paths it still might take. "I'd find a place where the past doesn't define the future," he said finally. "Where a man is judged by his actions, not his bloodline. Maybe a place where a doctor could build a practice without prejudice getting in the way." "That sounds like a good choice," she murmured. hope flickering in her eyes. Their hands found each other in the fading light, fingers intertwining with newfound certainty. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the clean scent of pine from the mountains. A reminder that beyond the mining camp, beyond Redemption Creek, a wider world waited. A sudden knock interrupted their moment. Harker's voice called through the door. "Riders spotted on the North Trail. Be here within the hour." "We'll be ready," Elijah called back. Sarah's hand tightened in his. "Together." The single word carried all the promises. Neither was yet ready. To voice aloud whatever came with the morning, confrontation, judgment, perhaps even danger. They would face it not as preacher's daughter and outcast, but as equals who had chosen each other despite everything that should have kept them apart. The cold night deepened around the mining outpost. Tomorrow would bring the chance to rewrite a story 10 years in the telling, to replace fear with truth, suspicion with understanding, and isolation with the most unexpected gift of all, belonging. As if to underscore this new beginning, the rain clouds that had shadowed them for days finally broke completely, revealing a sky ablaze with stars. Nature's reminder that even the most devastating storms eventually clear, leaving the world washed clean and ready to begin again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to. I'll pass these up, just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.